Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is Refupoet. We just went live once ago. So I will wait for people to join. And as I do so, I will introduce myself and introduce what Refupoet is, and also introduce what we are doing here today. So my name is Atieno, and this is Refupoet. Refupoet is a space that uses art to tell refugee stories of trials and triumph. We started our existence in 2018, where we hosted our first live event at Alliance Francais, where we brought together artists, refugee artists and Kenyan artists to celebrate refugees on the World Refugee Day. So from 2018, it has always been a culture where we bring together artists and we're able to just tell refugee stories and just hear what it is that they go through from an art perspective. It's also important to note that throughout last week, from Tuesday to Friday, we've been hosting this kind of conversations with various people, discussing various topics. And as promised, we're also going to be doing so for the rest of this week. And today we have a panel here of experts who are going to be talking to us about laws, regulations, and policies around refugee protection. So in case you have any question, if you've always had a question on laws, on policies, or on movement of refugees, please feel free to post it here, and I will be reading your comments, reading your questions, and asking our experts to attempt to answer those questions. So without further ado, I would like to take a round with my panel and ask them to introduce themselves. So I am going to start with John Paul. Please welcome. If you can tell us your name, what you do. Karibu sana.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, good morning, everyone. So my name is Jean-Paul Bahike Kasika. I'm Congolese by nationality. I've been in Kenya as a refugee for over 15 years. So I run an organization called African Youth Initiative for Development. So AYID. So it's a refugee-led initiative that I'm the founder and also the executive director for that organization. So I'm also a member of the Global Refugee-Led Network Steering Committee. So also the chair for the East Africa Refugee-Led Organizations. So represented in Kenya. Yeah, that's basically who is John Paul, and also work for serving Kituo as a paralegal. Yeah, so our organization is basically undertaking some interventions on gender empowerment and also livelihood activities. And we also conduct research and try to assist also our refugees with some protection issues, especially those in conflict with the laws, also the unaccompanied children, to give them some little support. And we've been distributing food recently to urban refugees. So basically to intervene, especially during the COVID-19, we've been there for our people since we understand them better than anyone else. The reason why, with the little support that we collect from friends, relatives, maybe abroad, at least we try to give it back to our community, to those who cannot, especially the most vulnerable families. So basically, that's what we do. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John Paul. Let me go to Elizabeth. Please, if you can introduce yourself, tell us who you are and what you do.
Hi, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Kabari. I am an advocate of the High Court of Kenya. I work as a legal consultant for HEART Kenya, which is Awareness Against Human Trafficking. So HEART is an acronym. We work with victims of trafficking, and we've taken I don't know how many of you are knowledgeable about trafficking laws, but we've taken the 4P approach, which is protection, prosecution, policy and partnerships, and protection and prosecution. I can't remember the fourth P, but anyway, yeah. So we help victims, we support victims of trafficking, and we try and work with government institutions to try and change the laws or even the way they're implemented. And we also spread awareness, and that is the capacity in which we largely work with refugee populations, because there's a huge overlap between trafficking on this side and refugees on that side. So they overlap quite a bit. And yes, so we've been working with victims since 2013. And before that, we've been doing awareness work for over 10 years, about 10 years now. Yeah.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I will bring Lena. Please tell us who you are, what you do.
Thank you, Atieno. Good morning, everyone. My name is Lena Moenga. I'm a legal consultant for the Refugee Consortium of Kenya in the program for legal and psychosocial support. Refugee Consortium of Kenya is a national non-governmental organization whose mission is to safeguard and protect the rights and dignity of refugees as well as host community through the provision of legal aid services. We provide legal aid, legal information, as well as legal representation in courts of law and other forums. We also offer psychosocial services. We offer advocacy and also capacity building and also promotion of inclusive governance. And in relation to today's topic, that's the laws and policies around refugee protection. Refugee Consortium of Kenya is the lead agency in the Interagency Committee for the review of the 2006 Refugee Act. I believe we will discuss more on that because it's at the forefront of today's discussion. So I will speak more about the activities that RCK is engaged in later. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry I called you Lena and it's Lena. So I will bring in Victor. I'm sure I'm pronouncing Victor correctly. Karibu, Victor, tell us who you are, what you do.
Thank you for that. My name is Victor Nyamori. I work with Amnesty International. I'm an advisor with a team there. I specifically advise on refugee-related issues, not only within the region, but also globally. Amnesty is a campaign and advocacy organization. So we work closely with refugees to identify some of the violations that refugees have. And we use this to campaign and change policies that affect them across the world. Thank you. I'm happy to have joined you here, and I hope we will be able to have a conversation.
Yeah, karibu sana, Victor. With me, I also have Desmond. Desmond will be assisting me in the facilitation. So perhaps, Desmond, you can just tell the people who you are before we move on.
Hi, my name is Desmond. So I'm going to be helping Atieno with moderation of the event, of the forum. And I'm a political scientist. I'm more interested in the politics and livelihood when it comes to people who are, especially refugees and people on the move. So I'm happy to be here. I hope we're going to have an amazing time. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Desmond. So I would like to kickstart this conversation before we just get into the relevant laws and the policies and the regulations. Perhaps, Jean-Paul, being a refugee yourself, would you please explain to us the difference between a refugee, a forcibly migrated person and an asylum seeker, just before we start off this conversation.
A refugee and an asylum seeker, it's a process. An asylum seeker is someone who just basically came in to seek asylum, who has not been recognized yet, and has to be taken through a process which is called an RSD process, Refugee Status Determination. So after the process, which should take specific time within the Act, that I think it should be 90 days, but which it's not practicable. So it should be within 90 days, but it goes up to a certain number of time, perhaps 2 years, depending on the nature of the case. So once you are recognized, then you automatically become a refugee under the definition of a refugee within the Constitution and also the United Nations Convention 1951. So if you meet that criteria, definitely you become a refugee.
Thank you, Jean-Paul. So also as a means of just introduction, perhaps Victor, if you would help us understand what the process is like, once someone runs away from their home and they enter the borders of Kenya, what happens? Is there someone who receives them at the border, takes them to the camp, and then introduces them to the processes that they need to take before they can now become a refugee? How does that process look like?
Thank you, Faith, for this. I mean, there is the ideal process, and there is what currently happens in the society. The ideal process is that when you are seeking asylum, when you arrive into a country, especially Kenya, you arrive in any of the borders. You can arrive in the official border points and non-official border areas. Official border points here, I mean, you can arrive in Namanga, that is in your arrival from Tanzania. You can arrive in Busia, Malaba, when you're arriving from Uganda. You can be arriving from Nimole border point when you're arriving from South Sudan. Or you can arrive in Doble border point when you're arriving from Somalia. The ideal situation is that when you arrive, you should make your application known to any person or any authority at the border point that you want to seek protection. And that particular person or individual, and specifically the government of Kenya, officials should be able to direct you to relevant officer who will be able to register you as a refugee and take you to refugee hosting areas. And specifically here we mean Kakuma refugee camp, Dadaab refugee camp, or any other situation or any other urban areas. Unofficial border points also you can arrive where, because of certain kind of traffic that has been seen on certain particular roads that are not official, you find that organizations including UNHCR and other humanitarian organizations set up reception centers at the border point. Or at the border area where there might be traffic of persons who are coming to seek asylum. So you get there, you find a humanitarian organization there who is receiving you, who can be able to help you reach to a place where you can register. Currently in Kenya, there are 3 registration points. One in Kakuma refugee camp, 2, the second one is in Dadaab refugee camp, the third one in mostly Nairobi. There's also a registration point in Mombasa, which is a bit still in terms of low number because of the people that are arriving area. There are also been indication that there are a registration point in Eldoret. Also, these are not very much active because of the lack of high numbers of people who are arriving in those locations. So when you arrive, at least you should be documented by the government of Kenya, where they take in your biodata and all the relevant details. I think I'll stop there. And I think Lena also know and understand this process more, can also pick up from there.
Yeah, thank you. Lena, do you have something you want to add? Yeah. On the same, on just what the process looks like.
Thank you. Victor has given the preliminaries of arrival in Kenya. We have the regulations which govern now the reception and the documentation, as well as the refugee status determination process. Now, once somebody has made known their intention that they intend to seek asylum in Kenya, and they should make that intention known within 30 days, as was in the Refugees Act 2006, but then as amended by the Securities Laws Amendments to make it to be immediately. That once you enter in Kenya, and then you must make your intention known immediately. So currently, what we have is that provision for making your intention well known, that you intend to seek asylum immediately. Now, you will be given an asylum seeker's pass. That is the document that now signifies that you are now going to be seeking asylum. And the asylum seeker's pass should be valid for around 1 year, or until you have gone through the refugee status determination process, which sometimes ideally should take 90 days, but it does not. It tends to take longer. So the asylum seeker's pass is always renewed until then you have completed the process. And after you complete the process and now you're recognized, then you will be given a refugee ID card. It's an ID card which is similar to what Kenyans have, with the same logo, but then written a refugee. So that card is valid for 5 years. That shows now that you're recognized. However, if then you are during the status determination process, you are not recognized, that is, you're declined, your application is declined, then you have you can seek an appeal. You can make an appeal at the Refugee Appeals Board, which then will determine your appeal. As Refugee Consortium of Kenya, we offer representation services for persons who are appealing at the Refugee Appeals Board. And if your appeal is again declined, then you have an avenue of pursuing a further appeal at the High Court. Yeah, basically that is what happens after reception.
Yeah, thank you for that, Lena. So there's something you've mentioned. You've mentioned the asylum seekers pass and the refugee ID card. So I would like to ask Elizabeth, are these two documents the only documents that refugees require to move around and to even access services whilst in host communities? Or are there other documents that they usually have to carry around apart from these two?
Okay, so I'll address this from two perspectives. The first is the legal perspective. So under the 2006 Act, refugees, if you have a okay, unfortunately asylum seekers don't, but refugees have the same rights as Kenyan citizens. So they have the rights that are given under the Constitution, which includes freedom of movement. And therefore, in an ideal world, and in an ideal situation, as a refugee, what you would need to show, the same way a Kenyan would be asked, is for your ID. For asylum seekers, they usually get the pass, and the bill that is coming up actually acknowledges that asylum seekers have, as long as you have the pass, then you have similar rights. In terms of you don't need to walk around with a lot of documentation. But unfortunately, I think we all know what happens when you're found by police. Those documents are usually not enough. So legally speaking, they should be enough, but practically speaking, usually they are not.
Let me just ask this to you again. Why are these documents not enough?
Well, I do not know. It's an implementation issue that I don't know how to put this politically correctly, but it's a level of impunity, I would guess. So police know they can harass you, and no one will harass them for harassing you, so they'll harass you. And even though, for example, if you're arrested, Now, unless you know people like Lena or people like John Paul and their organizations and what they do, usually you have no recourse. So it's a sign that the system has broken down, honestly. And it's a sign that there are changes that need to be made. And in terms of just rule of law, it should apply, the law should apply equally to everyone at every time. So if as a refugee, the law says you need those papers, those are the only papers you should need. You should not be asked for more. But now, because the rule of law is still a struggle that we have in this country, as a refugee, you'll be harassed because they see your vulnerability and they exploit it depending on what they want from you, whether it's money, whether it's just lack of human interest and, lack of concern for your fellow people. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth. Let me bring in Jean Paul. So perhaps if you can be kind enough to share with us how your experience was being a refugee in terms of like documentation. Were you harassed just in order to like have documentations before you could access some essential services? And perhaps you can just tell us also, I was speaking to a refugee girl last week, and she said that she was born in Kenya. Her parents are refugees, but then she was born in Kenya, and she's been trying to get a Kenyan identification for almost all her life, and she has never gotten that. So perhaps you can also shed some light on that.
Yeah, thank you so much. Maybe in regard to that, let me go back to what Elizabeth has just mentioned. I think apart from impunity, there is too much corruption. So the reason why they are doing that, because there is a lot of arbitrary arrest, especially on the refugees, whether you have an alien card, whether you still have an asylum seeker pass. So they take advantage of you. Number one, you might produce whatever document that is necessary, but still they confiscate the document and in order to extort money from you. So yes, it has happened to me sometimes back when I still had the asylum seeker pass. So it does not matter whether you are educated or not. So you cannot secure a job. So they still harass you, the law enforcers. So whenever you go, they are asking you like, what is this kind of a document? So they don't recognize that type of document. So it becomes a little bit difficult. And even if you try to explain, they are not understanding. So briefly is that if for the police officers or the law enforcers that are a bit engaging with the organizations that deals with the refugees, especially legal entities, they get to understand, they get to be sensitized, and they understand the type of documents that are there. And instead of taking too much time, they just release you or make a phone call to either Kituo, RTK, or contact maybe UNHCR directly and to get more information about that. And it states down on that paper on the asylum seeker pass, in case of anything, kindly contact us. But police do not have time to do that, of contacting maybe RAS, which is the department in charge, Refugee Affairs Secretariat. So they just take advantage. And you can't access some of the essential services, especially NHIF, KRA PIN. It is difficult, still up to date. Even accessing information like registering a SIM card with that asylum seeker pass, it's still difficult. So even with the refugee ID card, it's still difficult.
Yeah. Maybe let me bring in Victor. Victor, what do you think? What can we do about this? I mean, the law says one thing, but then on the ground, things are different. What can we do to change this situation?
For me, I think maybe they need to be a follow-up, and especially on the implementation of the new laws and the policies that are in place. At least it would help, and to conduct more sensitization, because as on day-to-day basis, police keeps on doing maybe reshuffles, the law enforcers. So at least we need to keep the spirit of maybe sensitizing and conducting a lot of trainings to the law enforcers. It would really help.
Victor, you can go.
Yeah, I mean, coming from an activist position, I mean, implementation of laws require the political will of those who are in high positions and those who take charge. I'll give you an example. I mean, the Refugee Appeals Board that we were talking about just a few minutes ago, the Refugee Act was set up in 2006 and started operation a few years later. But then 10 years down the line, it was only just the other day, it was only after 10 years that the Refugee Appeal Board was appointed, you know. It shows you, as much as we had the goodwill and the law there, it still lacked political will to drive that particular law for full implementation. Even today, there are some specific sections that are still being challenged, still people have different issues. So implementation starts with the political will. And I'll take an example where Uganda is. As much as there are different challenges that refugees face in Uganda, you feel the government has a political will to ensure that refugees enjoy their time in Uganda, access to livelihood opportunity, including owning land and having freedom of movement. If we have the same political will, starting from the leadership and the custodian of all laws, that is the president, going down to now the specific section, the specific ministry, and the specific relevant institutions, then the law will be implemented fully for the benefit of refugees and everybody. I think that's my view on that.
Thank you. And just a few discussion points we have had. There are a lot of questions coming in on our Facebook and YouTube. So I will invite Desmond to, ask this before we then go to what is in the new bill.
Thank you so much, Atieno. So I'll just go to the live section, the comment section on Facebook. We have Omeka Nyakundi saying that he's tuned and locked. We have Mary Liz saying she's tuned. Rebian following the conversation. Then there's a question for Elizabeth. Mary Liz asked, could Elizabeth please tell us more about the law in terms of asylum seeking in Kenya?
I think would it be possible for her to be a bit more specific? Okay, I'll try and answer it as it is, but if she has a specific instance in mind, I think that would enable me to be a bit clearer. So asylum seeking in Kenya is one of those things that we do because of international law, and especially after the Second World War and the large-scale displacement that happened, now countries realized it's necessary for them to accept as refugees and set up systems that can help them. So an asylum seeker, as John Paul explained, is someone who's not yet a refugee, but they have put in papers at the relevant government office, whether it's here in Nairobi or in Kakuma or in Dadaab, to ask for refugee status. So the law currently, as it stands, is very unfriendly to asylum seekers because the law looks at you as someone who's in the process. You're not an illegal immigrant. You're not a refugee. You're there in the middle. And the problem with that is it doesn't assign, although the Constitution, when it talks about rights, it says every person has a right to, there are very few constitutional rights that are for citizens specifically. So in an ideal situation, you should have the basic rights that are assigned to us in the Constitution: dignity, privacy, right to movement, right to associate, right to freedom from torture, freedom from discrimination. All those things should apply to asylum seekers. And that is the only protection, I guess, that they have under law, which should be weighty enough. But unfortunately, as Victor has said, the goodwill to implement the law is just not there. So even though you're an asylum seeker, you'll still, if you try to form an association, they'll harass you. If you try to move around too much, they'll harass you. And usually they harass you because you're what? An asylum seeker, and that's a ground of discrimination because it's on the basis of your nationality or your status. And yes, so the law as it is, if there was a will to protect asylum seekers and refugees, then the law would be sufficient. But with the lack of goodwill that we have from the political powers that be, then the law says one thing and then your lived experiences are completely different.
Just to pick up from what you said, I have a question for Lena. And Martin Mwangi is asking, what are some of the reasons that might actually make a refugee's appeal be declined?
And especially the international treaties that Kenya has acceded to, being the Geneva Convention of 1951, as well as the protocols thereunder, and also the OAU Convention. And then domestically, we also have laws. That's the Refugee Act of 2006 and the regulations thereunder. Now, all these laws, they outline who qualifies to be a refugee. For instance, you have to have faced persecution on account of race, religion, political opinion, or belonging to a certain social grouping. Now, if you come into the country and you registered as an asylum seeker, and now it's your time to go through the refugee status determination process, and you are found not to meet that criteria, both under the International Convention, the United Nations Convention, as well as the OAU, and even our domestic laws. If you do not qualify, then you will not be recognized as a refugee. And even if you appeal, the appeals are done on the basis of law. And there is not much more that can be looked at outside the law. So if you don't qualify under the definitions of who a refugee is, it's more likely that you will not qualify to be a refugee, you will not be recognized, and you will be required after the status determination process, you have been declined under that process, you'll be required then to exit the country within a certain period after being given the chance to appeal, and your appeals have also failed. There are also instances where someone might give conflicting stories, conflicting accounts of how they left the country, how they came in. You find that some people are giving conflicting information. It could be on the basis of forgetfulness, because also war can take a toll on someone. Conflict can take a toll on someone, it's psychologically. So you can find that you are giving different accounts of that. You will be given the space, or you'll be afforded the space to explain why do you have conflicting accounts of your entry into Kenya. Anyway, but that is really basically the reason. The reason, to Kevin, I'd say, is just the law. It is because of the law that you will not be recognized as a refugee. Thank you.
Okay, probably just before I invite Atieno back to the conversation, there's a statement here from Lisa, and she's like, it's unfortunate that even refugees who hold the ID card still face harassment from police officers. And I have a personal experience where I went out with my friends who happened to be refugees, and because the police could just identify he's tall, he's dark, he's Sudanese, of course. They came to us and they actually arrested us. And when they figured that he was actually a Sudanese with a Kenyan national ID, they still wanted money from us and held us for a couple of hours before they could let us go. In such a situation, what are there like specific steps that someone can face, can go through to get help when they are being harassed and they have the national ID.
Oh, thank you again. I believe the question is directed to me.
No, sorry. It was actually directed to Victor. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry, it's okay.
Lena, you can handle it.
Sorry, Victor, you are muted. What did you say?
You can handle it. I didn't capture that particular question.
Oh, yeah, I understand that there's a lot of cases of harassment that are taking place, especially with respect to refugees. And I believe what we have to start with, as my co-panelists have also said, is a case of sensitization and capacity building of these institutions to understand the refugee law. Because sometimes, as much as sometimes it's harassment, sometimes it's actually not knowing. You know, they see this document and they don't understand. What sort of document is this? You know, refugees have so many documents, from the Asylum Seekers pass to the mandate to the refugee card. Then we have the movement pass for the persons who wish to access the urban areas from the camp. We have the pupils pass. We have the conventional travel document for a refugee who would want to leave the country to go overseas, maybe for business or medication. So there are just numerous documents, and sometimes they might be confusing even to the police service, but also there are instances of genuine harassment. But I believe sensitization is very important, and it's something that comes out in the new bill, where the commissioner is mandated to sensitize the host community on refugees, that they are here rightfully. You know, it's an issue that we will have to work on, especially since it's provided for in the new bill, the social inclusion of refugees, so that we don't see them as outsiders, but they are here and they are under international protection. But yes, again, if there is harassment, like the case of Desmond's friend, then there are offices that you can report to. There are offices that you can report to so that such conduct can be investigated.
Atieno.
Thank you. Thank you for that session. And I think Lena has touched on what I would want us to take the conversation to. I would like us to talk about the new bill. But perhaps before we talk about the new bill, Victor, are you in a position to just tell us what are the existing laws currently right now? What are they? What are their successes and what are their failures before we can now dig into what is in the new bill?
Thank you for that. So Kenya currently, we have international law that we subscribe to, or we have already appended our signatures and we support, but also we also have our national laws that protect refugees here in Kenya. Nationally, our mother law, obviously, is the Constitution of the Republic of Kenya that also protects everybody that is in the country and also protects our rights of everybody, including refugees, on rights to life, all the basic human rights requirement. Then we have the Refugee Act, which specifically deals with refugee issues in the country, on how it's being managed and how it's operating, and how the government needs to accept and reject refugee status applications. And this is the 2006 Refugee Act that has always been indicated during the conversation. But then also we have the Citizenship and Immigration Act, but also which also touches briefly on migration-related issues, but also it refers back to the 2006 Refugee Act as the mother law for refugee-related issues. Apart from that, we have also subscribed or also appended our signature to the 1951 Refugee Convention, which is a global refugee convention that touch on refugees. We are also party to the 1969 OAU Convention on specific aspect of refugees in Africa, which also is being handled, which Kenya has also subscribes to. Regionally and within the East African region, there are specific developments that are currently happening related to policy that Kenya is also a party to. We have the East African Community Refugee Policy, which is still being discussed, hopefully it will form and guide how refugee issues will be operated in the East African region. We are also a member of the IGAD, and Kenya is party to some of the development we've had at the IGAD level, including access to livelihood, protocols on access to livelihood and opportunities for refugees, access to health and access to education. I think briefly those ones, but just to finalize, I mean, refugees are human like any other persons in Kenya, and we are protected by all laws, including laws that touch on how we drive a car and how we move around.
Yeah, thank you, Victor. And before I again go right into the new bill issue, let me just ask Jean-Paul, for a refugee or an asylum seeker who is seated, at home and listening and hearing these laws being mentioned, do they have a reason to smile, or are there any measures that should be taken beyond all these laws that we have?
Yes, they can have a reason to smile, but all in all, as my fellow panelists have said, there is still need for enough sensitization. If we say, as there have been sensitization, especially Lena said, yes, the government, as department in charge of the refugee RAS, should take lead, and the commissioner to sensitize the Kenyan community that yes, we have refugees here. They are also people and they have rights. They need to be protected. But have they done that? No. So in regard, there is also a question that is coming, which I can also see. It's in regard to the same, like, yes, they have failed on somehow. And on the laws that Victor was mentioning, like on the Kenya Citizenship and Immigration Act, you would see they are trying to put too much requirement, especially on accessing some of the documents. The refugees are compared to foreign nationals who just came in using their passport, maybe for businesses. So requirements are put the same, of which refugees cannot afford to some of those requirements that are put in, because they are just refugees. They fled from country of origin. Now they came to seek asylum. So you ask them to get some of the documents that they cannot afford to get, especially when they are applying for work permits, the Class M permit, which we believe that it should be free, but it is not the case. How many people today have Class M permit? So asylum seekers and even refugees themselves, I think the document itself, the refugee ID card, should be sufficient to maybe engage in an engage in some work activity that you can earn a living. But today becomes difficult. Many people that are engaging like security guards, they are ending not being paid because they don't sign contract, simply because they don't have valid document as per the employers outside there, because they tend to think these are not valid documents. The reason why they are being denied to sign contract. So by the time they are being dismissed, they are losing a lot. And we've been receiving quite a lot of complaints about such kind of cases. So I think there is a reason to smile if the sensitization will be there, and especially the agencies that are in charge to conduct more sensitization on host community, law enforcers, and also the refugees themselves. Tell them about their obligations and their rights. It will be much more better.
Thank you, Jean-Paul. So let me ask Lena, and after Lena, I'll ask Elizabeth whether the new bill seeks to address some of the challenges that we have mentioned. Lena, can you just explain to us what is in the new bill? What does it seek to address? And there's also the issue of public participation. Have refugees themselves been involved in the, making of this bill? Have the host communities been involved? Take it away, Lena.
Thank you, Atieno. And I understand Jean-Paul's, let me say, maybe displeasure with the currently how the situation is in terms of the laws that govern refugees. But I believe that this new bill, the Refugee Bill 2019, it has a wider interpretation of rights for refugees. It provides a safer asylum space as well as social inclusion of refugees into the fabric of society. For instance, maybe, and I will just be very brief because of time. For instance, Clause 28.4 of the Refugee Bill, it states that government officials on both levels of government have the mandate, or it makes it mandatory for them to enable refugees to contribute to the economic and social development of Kenya. As you can see there, by the time you are being enabled to contribute to the economic and social development of Kenya means you have been given a certain set of rights that will enable you to do that. It goes further to even make it a crime for someone to be engaged in gainful employment without paying tax. So some of your issues, Jean-Paul, have been addressed in this bill. As you can see, there's now the social inclusion of refugees, and if this bill passes in its current state, then you will see that refugees are becoming self-reliant, and they will not be relying probably on, donations or any other ways in which they manage to make a livelihood currently. We also have another provision, which I believe is quite progressive, is the provision on screening. In the 2006 Act, there's no provision for medical screening. There's just the provision for screening just to separate combatants from civilians during entry. But here we now have medical screening, which is important because then it protects the host communities as well as even the refugees who are in the country. And it seeks to address persons with contagious diseases, that they will be taken up and given assistance, medical assistance, as soon as they come into the country. And even in the context of COVID, you can understand how this provision is very important for it to become law. We also have durable solutions. That's another provision which has been expressly provided for in this bill. We know the durable solution, resettlement, voluntary repatriation, as well as local integration. Now, the understanding of voluntary repatriation and resettlement is just as is understood internationally. That's what is in the bill. But local integration, it has gone on to talk about the use of social amenities, the shared use of social amenities between host community and the refugees. And that is quite progressive because it's expressly set out there. It also mandates the commissioner to sensitize the host communities on refugee, and that will go a long way in addressing issues of social cohesion or lack thereof that we have seen currently. We also have a provision of the refugee register, which was also noted there in the Refugee Act 2006. It is important for us to have a refugee register for planning purposes, and also to enable refugees to access various services, so that at least the government is able to know who is in Kenya as a refugee and what is the demographic. It is important for planning purposes, and it enables them to also access services. And I believe that's also another issue that is progressive. There is also the removal of the limitation on the number of refugees that can be in the country at any particular moment. As you understand, this was included, the cap was included during the security laws amendments, where it provided that only 150,000 refugees can be in the country at any one particular point in time. And as you know, this since in Kenya we currently have over 470,000, if you limit the number to 150,000, that then forces issues of non-refoulement, return of a refugee to a home country where they are likely to face persecution. And that is against the international principle of non-refoulement. I believe the removal of the cap is also good and should make Jean-Paul smile and other refugees. We also have the creation of a refugee status eligibility panel. Now, this provides for another extra level of decision making when it comes to refugee status determination. So if you're not pleased with the outcome of this, the panel, then you have another forum, that is the refugee status eligibility panel. Before then, you can resort to the judicial system in Kenya, and I believe that's also okay. We also have express provision for protection for women and children. We all know that women and children are the ones that bear the brunt when it comes to armed conflict. So it provides here that during integration, there will be affirmative action, and women and children, as well as persons with disability, will be given some form of priority, and their interests will be taken care of. Another issue that I can mention is the extension of time within which to declare your intention of seeking asylum. Again, the Security Laws Amendment, it introduced an amendment where you have to declare your intention to seek asylum immediately. But now the bill reverses that, and it provides for 30 days within which you can express your interest, and that's good enough. That's good enough, because when you say immediately, it was a bit stringent. Now, Atino, you'd asked also a question on whether public participation has been done on the drafting of this law. Yes, public participation has been done, and whereas when we were drafting, when the 2006 Refugee Act was drafted, there was no constitutional requirement or other requirement for public participation. But with the promulgation of the new Constitution 2010, Article 10 of the Constitution, it makes public participation a national value as well as a principle of governance. And at Article 18, it makes it mandatory for Parliament to ensure that there's public participation and involvement of the public in all its businesses and the businesses of its committees, as well as legislative businesses also. So during the enactment of the Refugee Bill 2016, which was not assented to on the basis of there was no public participation, whereas we believe there had been public participation. Refugee Consortium of Kenya and its partners were then taken aback, and we wanted to understand what really is public participation, because what we believe the activities that were conducted would amount to public participation. That resulted in Refugee Consortium of Kenya's evaluation on public participation, and the result of that evaluation, informing us what really is public participation, is what has informed the activities that Refugee Consortium of Kenya has been involved in during the enactment of now the current Refugee Bill 2019, and we do not want to get it wrong. In fact, we have started involving, there has been public participation even at the conceptualization of the bill, before the bill was even drafted. RCK, as the lead agency in the Interagency Committee for Review of the 2016 Act, it led a fact-finding mission of parliamentarians, the lawmakers, the Departmental Committee on National Security, as well as the Departmental Committee on Justice and Legal Affairs. We took the lawmakers to the camp, the Dadaab camp and Kakuma camp, in order for them to experience firsthand what it is, what is life in the camp, and to also get to hear from refugees in the camp what are protection gaps in the current law and how can they be made better. So that is a form of public participation even before the legislative process begins. And RCK also, on its own, also conducted pre-public participation sessions with refugees and the host community, where we brought together refugees and told them this is what the law says, the 2006 Act. What would you want to have different in the law? How can it be improved? Now, the bill, currently we're waiting for it to go into the second reading, but after the first reading, it was committed to the Departmental Committee on National Security, where they also conducted public participation by inviting public memoranda. And RCK was at the forefront of lobbying for public participation to be done even in the camps. And for the first time, the refugees were involved in the process of legislation. Public participation was done in Kakuma and in Dadaab by presentation of public memoranda. Then it was also done in Nairobi, Mombasa, and Nakuru. So to a large extent, I can say that there has been public participation in more than one way. There's the one model where the right holders are invited to present memoranda and their opinions on the bill. Then we also have where the lawmakers listen to the views of the experts, and they have done that. The lawmakers also listen to the stakeholders, and they have done that. So to answer your question, Atieno, I believe there has been public participation. And it's a success that refugees have been involved in the process of lawmaking. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's really good to hear. And that was a very comprehensive cover of what is in the new bill. And from hearing how you've presented it, it sounds really beautiful, positive, and like a flower almost. I would just like to bring in Elizabeth. How are you feeling about this new bill? Do you think it's as, forward seeking as presented by Lena? And also, I'm just curious to know, does the new bill talk about the documentation issue in it? Karibu, Elizabeth.
Okay, so to add on to what Lena has spoken about, there are also some changes that the new bill is seeking to bring in, especially with definitions and things like the definition. It defined a spouse, and it actually recognizes spouses who, because technically you're a spouse if you have a marriage certificate, but as John Paul explained, getting these documents can just be a headache. So it's actually recognized common law marriages, which is what we call cohabitation, can we stay, whatever you want to call it. So the definition of a spouse has been widened in the bill that's currently pending, and also when it looks at the family member of a refugee, the definition is wider also. So it looks at not only children but just dependents. Are you a dependent on this refugee? And I think those were really, in addition to the issues that Lena has raised, those are really impressive additions. But one thing that concerned me a lot about the bill is there may have been participation before the bill and in its drafting and whatnot, but the systems that the bill envisions creating for refugees has no public participation, in my view. I say this because if you look at the structures that have been set up, the advisory committee, the appeals board, there was another one, I had written it down. The eligibility panel, yes. The three institutions that are set up in the bill, they don't have representation from refugees, and refugees are a very well-organized group. They have leadership, they have, there are hierarchies, and there are people who can speak on behalf of refugees. They don't have a position in any of these bodies for refugees, or someone who has gone through the process and can tell you what it looks like from a practical perspective. They don't have positions for, one of them, I think it's not the advisory committee, the appeals board talks about appointing 3 persons with knowledge about refugee matters. For me, that is extremely vague, especially my background's in trafficking, as I said in the beginning. So if you look at the Counter-Trafficking Act and the institutions that it sets up, for example, the advisory committee for the Counter-Trafficking Act has civil society in it. This advisory committee under the refugee bill does not. There's no civil society, there's no mandatory requirement that civil society be included. And for me, the question is, who knows better about what is going on with refugees on the ground, better than the refugees themselves and better than the civil society who help them? And why aren't these people in the institutions? So we'll pass the bill and we'll say, yes, we had public participation, but have we set up institutions that enable the continuation of that public participation? So I found, for me, that was a really big gap in the bill that we have right now. But I can finish on a bright note. I like the fact that also the Act looks at asylum seekers and refugee holders. So the bill. The Act that we have now talks about the rights of refugees. But the bill that's coming in talks about asylum seekers as well. So what are their rights? And actually expressly affords them the protections that are under the Constitution. And there was something Lena mentioned about contributing to economic and social development. Under the bill, asylum seekers can do that, which I think for me was a good thing. So I have very mixed feelings about the bill. That's the
Yeah, and I think before I invite Desmond to talk to us about what the people are saying, when Lena was speaking, I could see Jean Paul smiling at some point. So I want to hear how do you feel about the new bill? Are you in agreement with what has been said by the ladies, or what's your take on the new bill?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think maybe let me start from where Elizabeth just mentioned that yes, it sounds we might be happy with it, with the current bill, especially when it also involves the asylum seekers. So there is a lack of public participation in somehow because it just came a bit late and it's only a few number of maybe refugee leaders who've been consulted, and this is something that sensitization should have been done much earlier and the document to be availed to the people so that they read and see where they need to be corrected, because even within the refugee community we have people with the legal knowledge, and we have people and with other professionalisms that would have contributed maybe towards this bill. And also in, inclusion, I can say maybe inclusion is not there if in all these committees no refugee is represented. So if refugees are not represented, then nothing for refugees without refugees. That is a fact, because we understand much better where we come from, our country of origin, that we could advise even the committee sitting. It is ABC. Even on the current situation right now, I can tell you on what is happening. Because yes, I might be having friends, maybe some other relatives who are still there, and we are in communication, and we follow up on every single day the situation, the current situation, into our country of origin, and we could be at a better place to advise the committee. Because you said something else, Lena, that sometimes it leads to be declined the status simply because of some misinformation that you've given to the officer during the refugee status determination. Yes, I totally agree, but how would you know if these people are not part of that committee? Because they would advise you. If it's something to do with trauma, maybe you would also try to alert the officer. Yes, look at the situation first and foremost. You assess the person before bringing them into an interview room or proceeding with the RSD interview. Many people have been complaining, oh, the officer maybe didn't listen well. So to avoid all this, let also refugee be included in all decision-making level. They should be included. And the reason why we are saying, if you say anybody or anyone with knowledge on refugee matters, who has that knowledge? If you don't train them, first and foremost, you need to capacity build these people, especially the refugee-led organizations. We are so much organized. We have our leadership system whereby, yes, you're welcome. Come and train on any matters to do with refugee laws, any other instrument, so that they understand and we can select among some of us to represent into these committees or into these panels. That is where I don't think
Yeah.
it goes well. We need to be also represented.
Sorry.
Yeah.
It's, John Paul just mentioned something that struck me as odd when he's talking about inclusion of things that can be interpreted to, they look good on the face of it, but they can be interpreted such that they negatively impact refugees. I had seen Lena had talked about Section 28, the bit about people not, talks about paying taxes. No, I don't know if that was Section 28, whatever section it was, about employers are required to pay taxes. And I saw that and it struck me as odd, and I just realized why it struck me as odd, because I feel like the implementation of that provision will be that even the people who are willing to hire refugees before and give them whatever small income they were making will now be dissuaded from doing that, because if it's a crime for me not to pay taxes, yes, if it's a crime for me not to pay taxes on the refugees that I've hired, I'll just stop hiring refugees. I feel like there's something we need to, that needs to be tweaked in some way, because I get where it was going, because if you pay taxes, then you pay NSF, you pay NHIF, and it's a way to make sure you give refugees these protections. But the way the implementation can end up backfiring, and you know, the unintended consequences of this, I think, are something that we need to think about, rather than it going ahead and then we come back and this happens and then we're like, oops, then now we start we need to amend the law. I feel like that would, now is the time, I think, to address some of these things that they look good on the face of them, but in implementation they can backfire.
Yeah, yeah.
Maybe something else that I would want maybe to bring in another aspect. Sorry. Yeah, especially to what Elizabeth has just mentioned, it reminds me of something. Yes, if it comes of paying tax, some of them have been paying taxes, and even myself have been paying tax. So, but you understand there is no implementation. It becomes a bit difficult even with the current act that is there, the 206, because when you say they need to be a refugee register, yes, they need to be a refugee register, not just for purpose of having a register, but consolidating the data, the refugee data and the Kenyan data, so that whenever I go to apply maybe for any of document or for government services, my data can be easily identified or appear into any government system. But today, if you go to apply for KRA, it becomes a little bit difficult. If you key in your details or your ID, no data shows. So you go to apply for a work permit, the requirements that are there are too much for refugees. So they should put a distinction between refugees and foreign nationals who just came for other purposes. Refugee cannot afford that. They should limit, because for refugees, number one, you are asked, especially when you are applying for the work permit, you should have a qualification that no Kenyan has in order for the employer to give you that employment, which is that kind of a qualification. Sometimes for the interpreters, maybe it is their mother tongue, unless you tell me you yourself, you speak that mother tongue, or the immigration officials can provide you any other Kenyan who can speak maybe my mother tongue. You put maybe that is a valid one, but still you are denied.
Yeah, yeah. I think I would also like to ask a question from the audience, which is a little related to what Jean-Paul has just mentioned. And maybe let me bring in Victor to the conversation and ask this question before I let Desmond go through the rest of the comments. He asks, his name is Rover Jemba. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Can a refugee or an asylum seeker be able to acquire an NHIF card?
Yes, like I said, I mean, we have laws in the country that protects us and also protect refugees without any challenge. Currently, as the situation is, yes, refugee can be able to access NHIF card, and they can be able to continuously pay the NHIF subscription. This has been an advocacy with the local organizations, including UNHCR, who have been involved in a lot of advocacy with the National Human Rights, not national, I mean, National Hospital Insurance Fund, to the extent that they are now recognized refugee documents to be able to register for NHIF cards. But now the challenge is we have seen a number of situations. As much as people register, I mean, refugees also are having challenges in continuously paying this NHIF card because of the lack of opportunity to work and be able to have gainful employment, to be able to pay for all these services. So I encourage, yes, although this is just a bilateral discussions between the refugee organization and National Insurance Fund, my intention is that we'll reach at a situation where any document that refugee has is recognized anywhere, You can register with it at NHIF card, you can register SIM card, you can access driving licenses with it, and you can be able to even open bank account with it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Desmond.
Yeah, thank you so much, Atieno. I will just go through some of the comments, and then I'm going to ask questions simultaneously, and they're going to take a sequential form. So I'll call your name, and then I'll just give you a question as I ask the next one. And then when I'm done, probably we can just answer them the same sequence that I used. So I'm having here Wanaina Triza. She's like learning a lot from the discussion. Thank you. Charity Ongoi is like great conversation. Ezekiel Moenga, a great informative discussion. And then we have Rova Jemba. I honestly hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. It's like, thanks for your concern. Rachel Stephanie is like learning lots. And then that brings me, Millicent Olo, she says, very informative. Thank you for the great discussion. And which brings me to my sequential questioning. We have Winnie Mutevu, and she's specifically directed her question to Victor, and she's like, I would like to hear from Victor what will happen to a refugee who has been trafficked to a country where they did not acquire their refugee status. What is provided under the law to protect them? Where are they repatriated to? My next question will go to Liz, and it's from Robin Omeka, and he's like, is there some form of advocacy that is underway that we Kenyans and host communities can rally behind to push the police force to make reforms? Because if implementation is the issue, then, if implementation is the issue, then it is the enforcers who have an issue and not the due process of the law. The next question, give me a second, please. My next question will go to Paul. And the question is from Junior Rova Jembe again. He's like, how can you handle violence against LGBTQI persons in the camp? And the last question will go to Lena. I'm just picking up the question. It's from Rina, that's her name. And she's like, is there an instance of priority cases, and what criteria is used to determine a priority case? Yes. Back to Victor.
Thank you very much for the question. Yeah, it's quite an interesting question, especially on the issue of trafficking and refugee protection. And this we can pick from a specific example where a refugee somebody can arrive here, then register as a refugee, then are trafficked to another location, specifically maybe of say Ethiopia or Europe, for that matter. Well, the regime for refugee protection is always to protect somebody not to be returned to a country where they are always facing at risk and their lives will be at risk. And so if somebody finds themselves in Ethiopia and was registered as a refugee in Kenya, then the laws or global laws or globally require that when they are there, unless they have a persecution of the specific country where they are coming from, especially, let's say, Kenya, then they should not be returned to Kenya. But then also, they should also not be returned to their country of origin, meaning if somebody was a Ugandan sought refugee in Kenya, trafficked to Ethiopia. At that instance, when they come into contact with refugees, then the country is required to conduct an assessment on which specific place is feeling safe and willing to return. We have had, I'm actually dealing with a case of even a stateless person who was given documents for Mauritius, lived in Dubai, but found traffic was smuggled into Europe. So there are discussions with where would you be assessing his claim, because most of his life he lived in Dubai. Our argument was the fact that, well, he lived in Dubai, he just had documents for Mauritius for the purpose of traveling. The process of assessing the claim should only be based on the situation in Dubai and not the situation in Mauritius. Mauritius can only be used as a reference, but also when assessing persecution, to be based on that. But then also you should not be returning a person where their lives are at risk. If Mauritius is still the person, their life is at risk, they should not be returned. Also in this, where the country the person is coming from. UNHCR has just recently released some documents which they call policy guidelines on what's the word? They call them, well, I don't know, I've just forgotten the specific name, but these guidelines advise people or advise states on how to handle cases of refugees who leave the countries where they are registered as refugees and get themselves available in another country. So it will be able to guide you. If at all you have access to this document, Winnie can be able to share with you. It can also guide you on what UNHCR implications and recommendations to states on how to handle such particular cases. Thank you.
I think the next question was to
Elizabeth.
To Elizabeth? Yes.
Yes. So advocacy for police reforms to ensure implementation of the law. I think in light of what's going on in the world generally, particularly in the United States, I think we can learn a lot from that and stop looking at police reforms from a narrow point of view and stop looking at police brutality specifically from a narrow point of view of police are, harassing Kenyans, and in these times of COVID, if you're not in your house, then they beat you. I think we should look at police brutality on a larger scale, which includes harassment of refugees. It includes violence against women. It includes, it's a larger umbrella. It's not just police refusing people to protest and beating people, or the way police have been targeting young boys, especially in informal settlements in Nairobi. So I think if we can lend our voices and if we can lend our minds and our energies towards broadening our idea of police brutality, and therefore whatever reforms come out of what is currently being pushed for now, because I'm aware there was a march, I think last week, Monday, against police brutality. And I'm like, yes, that should also include police harassment of migrants, police harassment of refugees, police harassment of women. It should not just be, the narrow definition that we have. So I think those are the current advocacy initiatives that I know are going on currently. And I think if we can lend our energies to that and push for the widening of the ideas that we are trying to challenge, then we'll kill two birds with one stone.
Yeah, thank you. I think it was Lena who was next.
Okay, my question was on whether there are cases that are given priority. I did not quite understand in what context. Isn't the concept of receiving asylum seekers into Kenya or during RSD, or I did not quite understand, but cases of unaccompanied minors during reception and also during RSD should always be given priority because, of course, of the protection concerns that come with a child who is unaccompanied, who does not have anybody. They should also be put under, there is the organizations that are concerned with refugee management, they have mechanisms to help and protect children who are unaccompanied. They save houses for such children. So from the person who was asking the question, I don't understand if it's during the RSD process, but what came into mind on priority was about unaccompanied minors. But there's also refugees who have protection concerns, genuine protection concerns, because of course of where they come from, maybe of warring, I don't know, communities. All right, there's such protection concerns that would arise. And if a refugee has such a protection concern, insecurity, then they would, during registration or during reception, they would make that concern known to the Refugee Affairs Secretariat or the UNHCR. And from there, other protection mechanisms would also come in terms of safe housing or other protection mechanisms that can be put in place by the two bodies.
Yeah. Thank you, Lena. So before we go to Jean Paul, I think you had a question that was directed to you. I would also like to just add one more on top of that question. And before I also do that, I would just like to thank everyone who is sticking with us. I know this conversation is taking a little longer than the other conversations we've been having, but we are allowing it to because I think it's a very core conversation that needs to be had, and it almost forms the basis of all other conversations. So this is why we are allowing this conversation to continue, but we are almost. And Dave Jock asks this, Jean Paul. How effective and efficient are NGO services towards the urban-based refugees? And are there any security measures that protect them within the urbans? And if so, how do they access them?
That is, I think, posed on me.
Yes.
So I think there were two questions, one on the LGBTI, the LGBTQ, and that one, right? So on the...
Yes.
Let me start on the LGBTI. If it's any case that arises in the camp, there's also agencies that deals with that, especially RCKs there, which addresses legal issues in the camp. If it's any form of insecurity, they can report to RCK. Before they go to any agency, they must make sure that they report to the, is it community leader, and they go to the police, then they can proceed to the RCK. Also, there is an assessment that is being conducted or done in the camp based on cases. If you have any form of insecurity, you've been attacked, so they need to assess. Protection desk need to assess and see if there is need of data transfer or transferring that case to Nairobi or in urban. Then it is upon the protection unit to decide upon that kind of case, depending on how it is and the fact. So on the other one, we have also many of the NGOs that addresses these human rights issues, especially for the refugees in urban, including Amnesty there. They address this, and they are at a better place. We have Kituo cha Sheria, we have RCK also. So all of us, we need to pull our socks and address the same issues, because we find that, yes, the same issues that are being raised by refugees in urban are the same also issues that may be facing the refugees in the camp, but for the urban, it's a little bit different. So I think we are there, we are reachable, our offices are open, the services are free of charge, so they can approach us depending on the nature of issue. If it's about the advocacy, I think I had mentioned earlier, it is an effort that we need to bring all of us together and see how to intervene into this matter.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Jean-Paul. David Jock, I hope you have been answered. You can visit RCK's website. You can visit. I think after this stream, you're going to post all your social media platforms here so that everyone who needs to can go visit. So I would like to really conclude this conversation right here. But just before I do, there's one question, and I really, really like this question. It comes from Martin Mwangi, and perhaps I can ask you, Victor, to tell us. He says, let's say that we as Kenyans wanted to lobby the government to create a better space for refugees in Kenya. Which particular offices do we knock? Does it require some form of signed signatures?
Thank you, Martin, for that particular question. Everybody, anywhere, anytime can always add voice to the situation of refugees. You can be in your house now currently, just by watching this video and sharing out to other people and also network. It's also a form of sharing or showing concern to refugees. The current office that specifically deal with the issues that related to refugees is the Refugee Affairs Secretariat. There are specific offices in Nairobi, in Mombasa, in Eldoret, in Kakuma, and the Dadaab refugee camp. There are different issues that refugees get to handle. And one thing I will encourage Martin is to join into the networks that touch on refugees, just by engaging on Refugee Poets or following up with the Amnesty International membership. You can be always get updates on situation of refugees. RCK also has offices across Nairobi, and also I'm very sure John Paul can also be able to give its contact where there are areas and issues that you can share and where you can be able to add your voice. Yes, the opportunities for signatures are there, opportunities for just writing letters, opportunities for just calling on specific officers to do the right thing and also protect refugees. We hope that we'll be able to engage more with Martin and any other person who is interested in refugees issues. Continue following up on Refugee Poets page. Follow up with Amnesty International, follow up with the Refugee Consortium of Kenya and other refugee-led organizations, including what John Paul and others had mentioned. You will be able to handle one particular issue and share concern. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Victor. And it is just on that note that I will conclude by saying that anyone who is following this conversation or has been following this conversation is definitely making a positive impact to the state of refugees in this country. So I would like to thank everyone who has joined us from the beginning to this very end of the conversation. Thank you so much for asking your questions, for commenting, for following. The support is highly appreciated. Let me just say that for the rest of the talk about refugees and education, we're going to talk about art and refugees. We're going to talk about peace building initiatives amongst the refugees, and we're going to touch on integration, especially tomorrow. And on Saturday, which is the climax of what RefuPoet has been trying to do, is we're going to have a festival, an online refugee festival to celebrate the World Refugee Day. And we're going to be enjoying some music, some poetry, and some dance from both Kenyans and refugee artists. So I would really encourage you to follow us on our Facebook, YouTube page, and on our Instagram as well, because we're going to be posting that event. Really, really say thank you to our panelists. Thank you for being so patient.
I think